Hello, and welcome to the Gauntlet podcast. Each month, we look back at games played on and off the Gauntlet by Gauntlet folks. My name is Lowell. I use he, him pronouns. I'm first joined today by my co-host, Sherri. Sherri, how are you doing?
I'm doing okay so far today.
And we are, as our guest, joined today by Steph, better known as Chaotic, who is a prolific GM off the Gauntlet and has done a lot of running of the Between. And if you go to our Gauntlet blog, recently co-wrote a piece on borders in the Between. That's really excellent with a lot of new interesting rules and materials. Steph, thank you for joining us today.
Glad to be here.
So for our first segment, each of us gets to go over RPGs that we played in recent months, May, June, and beyond. And we're going to talk about one depth that we played on the Gauntlet or even off. Sherri, how was your gaming in May, June?
May, June remains sort of light just because of the projects that I'm in. So off Gauntlet, I played 13th Age and I was playing in a playtest of Ballad Beyond. And then on Gauntlet, I played Arc Ball. It was reskinned for Star Wars and called Smash Ball. And it looked to be fun, but we didn't get to finish it out. I would love to go back to that game. But I also played a nice long series of Voidheart Symphony, and I think that's what I'm going to talk about today.
Okay.
So, what is it? So, Voidheart Symphony is a TTRPG that kind of springs forth from the Legacy bloodline of games. And the more Legacy-like forerunner of the game is Rhapsody of Blood, which sort of harkens to Bloodlines attempting to defeat an evil castle, kind of like that video game Castlevania series. But with Voidheart Symphony, it's the players that go into an edifice of supernatural power that's corrupting their world. So this one is less about Bloodlines, and it centers on the player characters. So that's very different from Legacy, but it does come from that. And essentially, these characters are called rebels. And instead it sort of brings in the idea of phases of play. Not as exactly defined like they are in Blaze in the Dark, but it has that sense of you have these moves and these things that you need to do before you can go to the castle. And they're very set in that way. So it has phases of play that include everyday actions, investigation, and then there's the actual assault on the castle itself where you go to take down one of the avatars of the castle. And while you're doing that, you're also taking out obstacles and enforcers of the avatar before you get to the avatar. So there's lots of prep that you do beforehand. And then once you get all of the things taken, like essentially enough that you feel that you might be able to handle the situation, you go into the castle. The character playbooks have names like the Provider, the Watcher, the Heretic, just kind of standard roles for, someone who's doing a secret, supernatural undertaking. These give a small set of core moves and pick lists for ideas about what your actual role is within the crew, crises that you personally have, gear that you have access to, particularly in your supernatural doings, shadow moves, which are like special moves that only when you're in castle do you have access to, and then also what tarot you present to the players. So here we bring in that idea of the tarot, and this kind of harkens back to the thing that Persona is stated as one of the strong influences for and inspirations for this game. So the tarot is very important in the video game Persona of the whole series. And in this game, when you make your character, you choose what tarot you present to the rest of your crew. So it's about your identity, but it really is about your identity with them. And these tarots have a set of 3 moves, essentially. There's a hangout move, a city move, which means like sort of the everyday move, but like in the investigation or in handling essentially the effects of what this supernatural place is doing to your world around you. And then the castle move. The thing is that these allow you to define yourself relative to your crew and with your relationship with NPCs. When you make a connection with an NPC, like a confidant in Persona, you find out what their tarot is, and that defines what your relationship is with that NPC. That NPC with another member of your crew might have an entirely different tarot, because that's who they are to that person. So many people pick the whole castle plus tarot, saying that it is directly affected by Persona, but there are clearly some other sources in this game. but Persona is definitely one of them. There's a game engine, or maybe several game engines. It's hard for me to tell. I don't have a master's in game theory, but essentially you are moving things like gauges with names like blood, infamy, heat, a couple of other things that essentially are gauges of the higher you go, the higher you have to roll in order to succeed at your moves. You also build up and exhaust the relationships with your NPCs and with your crew. Those are the covenants. So you can make those more powerful so that you have access to more moves, or you can spend those down or let them sort of lapse. And that reflects your relationship with your crew and with those confidants. And then there are these conditions that you can get and steal that give you disadvantages on particular moves. Okay, so just understand there's a lot of moving parts, just like any game is likely to have. Those are the ones I wanted you to know about. So what worked for me when I was playing this game is the Tarot Covenants did a lot to make the NPCs very much their own unexpected forces in your life. So it was fun to see the game interpretation of the tarot, but it was also you would choose, you would make a connection with an NPC, and then you'd be picking a tarot that seemed maybe like them. But always one of those three moves would be like, what? Well, okay. I guess that's how they actually are. So there was always it was always tossing some random tarot idea dice into your life, and that was sort of fun. There are a bunch of interesting ideas to play with here, with all of these, with the interactions of the different phases and the way that the crew members could and could not assist. It was super fascinating and made some good story. One of the things is everything is very driven by moves in this game, and that is both in the sense of things that you can do and things that you really can't do in that moment is interesting thing. I think it is one of those things that you have to play for a little while to get a feeling for what you're actually doing when you say you're going to make a move and do those things. Also, getting ready for the castle was challenging, and the fight through the castle was challenging. And the clocks kept things moving along. So sometimes you get a game and the whole purpose of the game ends up being a little cakewalky. This wasn't particularly that. You had to use all of your resources and everything that you had managed to build up during your downtime in order to make it through. If there's anything that I'm less sure about, I just have to say, holy smokes, that game engine is non-symmetric. There are critical parts of mitigating the harsh effects that are buried down in the tarot. You need to make yourself a list, on the side of ways to reset those gauges, ways to quell crises, ways to clear conditions, and bold up all the moves where it's a set outcome in that move that you're going to take a ding on one of these sort of standard things that you have. Because there are a lot of wrenches in these mechanics. There are a lot of moving pieces and a lot of painful prices, which of course made it like you had to pay attention all the time and you had to be thinking pretty hard about the game mechanics themselves. So I liked the tarot. I also hated the tarot sometimes. I think the weirdest thing particularly was when two members of the crew were interacting during the hang-ups and both moves kicked off, and it would seem really socially awkward in some ways, like they didn't always go together. So it surprised you, but also sometimes you had to work really hard to come up with an explanation of why these two things were happening in this particular hangout. And then the game takes a bit to get rolling, and it feels like it needs some real space to breathe. So it's never going to be a one-shot. It's never going to be a two-shot. It's going to be, you're going to put some time into it. I would say at least a mini campaign, but probably just a campaign. And it definitely behooves the GM and the players to have a serious chat about who the group is. Our game had 2 players familiar with Persona. They made high school students. And 2 players who weren't, who made adults. And that made hangouts kind of, you had to work out how to make them reasonable and stuff like that. So this is the thing that's a session 0. You wanna get everyone on the page of like what sort of group of folks you are. And I think high school students and adults could have worked if we had built some sort of social structure that we were from a part of or something. But we hadn't done that. We didn't know it would be necessary. So my takeaway is we had some really good moments in this game, but it never felt like we hit on a shared sense of purpose. And somehow because of that, I think it remained a set of game mechanics for a little while. So if I had to say anything, I'd say session 0 super critical, and also figure out those game mechanics before you get too far in it, just so that you know how to fix the things because there's pressure in there to make you do things, but you need to figure out how you can take the pressure off so you can continue to do things. But it is interesting and fascinating game. So that's my takeaway.
I notice you've avoided two key points before I turn to Steph to see Steph's questions here. One is, it's really Persona 5 versus Persona 3 or 4. Like, it's very much echoing the purpose of that, going into these vassals shards. Two, you've avoided the fact that when you're in the real world, you have one set of resolution mechanics and the dice work one way. And then when you go into the castle, then work in a different way. You're actually rolling PBTA in the castle, but not in the real world. And you have to switch back and forth.
And yes, you've got different pressures because of different mechanics in both of those places. It is a system that takes some consideration before you undertake play.
Steph, thoughts? Have you played Legacy or Voidheart or Persona?
I've played Persona, but I'm not very familiar with Legacy. From what I've heard about Voidheart Symphony, it's similar mechanically to, like, Blades in the Dark, like an adjacent, I've heard.
Yeah. It has phases like that does. And it does have the roll a couple die and try to get over for the things that you're doing in the everyday world. But then when you move to the castle, then you're rolling straight PBTA.
Like, I know for my own Blades in the Dark game, we spent character creation an entire, 3-hour session. Like, it definitely requires a lot of discussion and thought.
There's an idea about being a crew where it really helps for the crew to have a sense of what it is that keeps them together,
And the game actively works against that because the Session Zero character creation process is make a few choices, and then we throw everybody into one of these shards, and you play that out, and then you make choices afterwards. So it doesn't go, okay, let's talk about why we are here as a group. It's much more thrown together. Any other questions or thoughts, Steph?
I'm just wondering, the sort of, what type of person would enjoy that? And I'm wondering if it's, if a person's more comfortable, with GM-less play might enjoy that more.
Interesting. Yeah, there is a certain amount of structure that supports people, which I know a good GM-less games kind of tell you what phase you're in. I don't think it would be too hard to run this GM-less because a lot of the parts do move themselves. It was
complete reframing.
Yeah, I will say it was, I think, session 4 before I I think I might understand how this game works now. So it is a learning curve on that. So let's move on. Steph, tell us about your recent gaming and what you want to talk about.
I have to go back for my gaming a little bit because most of the games I do play are off-Gauntlet. I run a lot of the between. I'm running 2 games currently, and I'm playing in a third.
Nice.
I'm also playing in a Blades in the Dark game and in a bi-weekly Monster of the Week game. On Gauntlet, I have to go back to GCOG because that's the last time I really played, because most of the time on the Gauntlet, I'm just talking about games rather than playing them. Yeah. But I ran 2 games of Bluebeard's Bride, played in Siron, Cthulhu Dark, To See with Eyes Unclouded by Hate, Nobilis, the game of Sovereign Powers, Trophy, and Hearts of Wooing. And I'm going to be talking about Nobilis. And it's a very hard game to describe, besides it being a diceless story game that is extremely crunchy when it comes to character creation, but in play runs very smoothly. It focuses on a family of powers in the worlds upon the world ash. And the powers are the PCs. They're called sovereign powers, which just means mortals given a part of an imperator's soul. In more digestible terms, it means that a god gave you a part of their soul, so you've become a servant and have to protect the domain from any trouble. In the particular GCOG session, we went a little bit meta. The GM has hopping around different GCOG games on a scavenger hunt for specific items, and it was a bit ridiculous. We only really got to 2 worlds. The first being, the Firebrands game of a school for girls. I can't remember the full title. And the other being like a cyberpunk game. What worked for me is the way that the powers worked. For as much crunch there was getting through character creation, we spent like an hour on that. The system handled it in an interesting way. It was very much like a conversation that you would see in like more rules-light story games. And there was just this sense of joy, of just being a little bit meta and a little bit playing with like, what do we know? How do we act? And just like we get to refer to like other games and just like settings, because that wasn't the important fact. The important fact was that we were here and we were interacting with things. And it was like my last game after like a very long gaming weekend. Like Bluebeard's Bride, Cthulhu Dark, they are very, very dark games. So just having like this kind of silly game, it was very good. And I really do not know how to describe this system because like Jenna Moran, the author, also used this system for her layered games, Kubo's Marvelous Wish Granting Engine and Glitch. But I'm not sure what to call it because she doesn't really call it anything, but like it's just the Moran system, I guess. And a very neat thing about the character creation, because it was so crunchy, there was also pre-gens. Like, the powers were already determined, but however, the specific skills, the specific abilities about how they interacted was determined by the players. And I just find that very fascinating for con game, because like, in con games, sometimes you're just handed a character sheet and you're like, what does this all mean? And like, you just get a little bit confused about that. What I'm less sure about is campaign play. I have no idea what you're supposed to do for that.
This may be a common thing to Moran games, because I've had that experience looking at those, yeah.
I will say, I've taken a look at both Kubo's and Glitch. I feel much more confident about campaign play.
Oh, really?
Because there's more mechanics built in. Nobilis, as far as I can tell, doesn't have a system called quests, whereas the later games do, in which you put quests together to form an arc. So that's how you would handle campaign play. Nobilis doesn't have that, so I'm just wondering if like I could just tack on that instead. And with being like very high level power, like how do you do character development or that sort of thing? And something I did notice during play, like during like the last bits, because like we were taking turns about like who was quote unquote protagonist, as it were. Sometimes it was just a little bit confusing for people. What did their powers mean? Like for me, I'm very good at like interpreting powers in different and weird ways because that's just the way I think. And like the game requires you to really think about things, about how powers work, because like having power fairy tales, like how do you incorporate that in like a cyberpunk setting? Like it's just kind of clashes a little bit. But we got there in the end. And my main takeaway is like, after playing it, I would run other Jenna Moran games because like I have them on my shelf and I was like, I have no idea if I'm ever going to be able to run this. But now I feel like I could. I just have to like borrow the GM's character keeper and make some adjustments for the other games. But yeah.
There was a chat that Jim Crocker mentioned about the idea of games that you'd want to play, but you'd want somebody else to run. Do you feel like this was a good teaching game for opening up the rest of that space?
Yeah. This game really needs to be taught before you actually run it, because it's just so very different. And because, like, for all its intents and purposes, it seems to contradict itself. But when you go into, like, Jenna Moran's, like, history of making games and her other professional stuff, like, she's got, like, a couple different degrees in, like, computer science, and if you take different game that does not use the Moran system, Wisher Thurgis Fatalist. It really shows, like, the sort of computer logic at play and, like, Moran's design philosophy. It's very much an art game. It's everything that you think of, like, oh, this is a story game, this is how it is, and turns people off, and like, has people who are very big fans of the games are like, oh, no, it's still a game. Jenna Moran's games are games, but at the same time, they're not games, but rather thought experience. And I adore that, but for others, it's going to be like, I'm not sure. But any questions?
Yeah, tell me about your character, because that's always the kind of concrete thing I need to get a picture of what's going on.
We were playing different aspects of the hunts, and my particular character had the aspect of surprise. And the main ability of that was me being able to arrive on time for anything. So when I got kicked out of the scene, they were just about to find something, and I was like, you know what? I'm going to arrive here on time. Like, I may have gotten sent to bed, but it's alright, I'll get there.
That's great. I remember some of the early Moran stuff. She did the fairy source book for the first edition of Exalted, and it was so wild and weird, and I think they erased all of those ideas when they kind of redid it for second edition. And then Weapons of the Gods, the really complicated mechanical system wuxia game, has this wonderful idea of these lore sheets where you spend points to connect your character to stories of the world, both like historical stories and mythic stories and things like that, and that's what you spend your points on. So there's a real theme there.
Yeah, I would recommend, if anyone's interested in Jenna Moran's games, to get a physical copy, just so you can see the scale and scope of the games, because they are textbook sized and could destroy a person.
Awesome. So for me, off-Gauntlet, we had a lot of bumps. This early summer has been wild for knocking games off the schedule. But I did run 13th Age. We're up to like level 8 of 10 of that, and getting towards the end of that long campaign. On the Gauntlet, I did Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition Eberron. I did some Hearts of Wulin 2-shots. Of course, did Voidheart Symphony. We did Worldwide Wrestling, the first edition of that. And then we did Haunted West, but the PBTA version of that. And that's what I want to talk about is Haunted West in general, but more particular, this add-on. So Haunted West is a Kickstarter supported, did pretty well. Historical Weird West RPG by Chris Spivey, who also did Harlem Unbound, along with a big crew of supporting authors. And it mixes two themes. First, that is exploring and presenting the often marginalized history of Black, POC, Indigenous, LGBTQ persons in Western tales. And two, it's adding that to the kind of high, weird Western stuff that you get in things like Joe Lansdale's writing. And then more commonly in TTRPGs, I think the first big one for that is Deadlands, and that's sort of the big touchstone. It has its own standalone and, I'm going to say, fairly trad rule set to the book. The book itself is 800 pages long and glossy and big and heavy. Now, much of that is backstory and history and, diving into these areas. It's a rich, rich, rich book. One of the stretch goals that they hit in the Kickstarter was to add an appendix with a PBTA version of the game by Amir Amuraz, and basic moves, playbooks, and it's 14 pages. And that's what I played from. So I want to talk about what worked for me first. One thing is kind of a meta thing that has worked is the reason I got to play this is on the Gauntlet, on our Gauntlet Slack, and even on the Gauntlet forums. We do game requests. We have people post games that they want to play. We have a special channel for that on the Slack. And I had posted a number of games that I really wanted to play. And Puckett saw that I wanted to play Haunted West and took me up on it and arranged it and set up a game a couple months down the road. And I love that. I love, as a GM, watching and seeing people ask for games and being able to provide those, and for people being, willing to jump in and help others out. So that's a really cool thing. I think if you have a gaming community, an online gaming group or community, you need to have a channel and encourage people to do that. It's really, really fun. The PBTA adaptation is a good, solid, lean PBTA adaptation. Again, 14 pages. It very much assumes that you're coming in knowing how PBTA works. I mean, it has some very basic elements at the start, but it's for PBTA veterans. I don't think if you hadn't played that, you could go from that in the back of the book. It has a really cool set of playbooks, like the Gunfighter, Mystic, Resolute. I think there are maybe 10 playbooks, if I recall correctly. And each of them really does capture the feeling, kind of based on the classes that the game itself provides, the core features that are offered, the things that they can do kind of without picking moves are pretty rich in each of the playbooks. There's some nice choices on equipment and things like that. So I really like that. And in general, the other thing is just Haunted West itself is a great book to flip through. It's a great book to read pieces of. It's a dense and wondrous resource. It has a ton of great play elements. If you're interested in the history of overlooked communities in the Western and the Western genre, you should pick this up. If you're interested in Weird West and, aliens and supernatural and ghosts and things like that, that's another reason to pick it up. I think either of those groups, this is the game for you. So that being said, what I'm less sure about, so it's an appendix. It's a PBTA appendix at the back of the book, and it does rely on some material and rules terms from earlier in the book that are outside the PBTA section. It doesn't do a great job of pointing you back to that. There need to be some better page references and some better like, hey, you're going to be adding this in. So you do need to go through and kind of grok the original rules at least a little to make it click. In particular, the thing that we found is there's a thing called the stance system, which is in the sort of trad rule section of it that they brought over into the PBTA section, and it wasn't clear exactly how that worked, and it took some massaging for us to kind of get that under our belt. The second thing is, and this is a thing that we see in some PBTA games, where there are gaps in the basic moves. Like there are things that, okay, I want to do this. Let's look at what the basic moves are, and they're not easy to fit. Like I'm used to negotiating with basic moves, to figuring out, okay, well, I think that feels like this is this. But here, the negotiation of what move was appropriate wasn't clear because the basic moves were narrow, or the definition of what it does, or particularly the trigger for it, was either very narrow or added its own kind of directive, like, you're doing it this particular way. So in certain cases, things didn't fit. And that was a little frustrating. Kind of, it became a speed bump for play, where I'm used to PBTA, kind of roll on, we hit the move, it keeps us going, we keep the momentum. Here, there were several times we had to stop and figure things out. There's a damage system in it, vitality, lucidity, wounds. I honestly think by the end of the 4 sessions, I don't think any of us really actually knew how that worked. Even though we had taken damage, it was a little unclear. I also mentioned that each of the playbooks has a cool idea of expertise. I like that. I like it when you give some benefits to a playbook that are kind of thematic, like in the Veil, getting to choose what certain elements of the world are. In this case, you've got expertises that are things that your playbook, your character knows. So, for example, I ran the Gunslinger, and when a gunslinger sees an outlaw, they always know what the bounty is on that outlaw. And there were 3 of these things on each of the playbooks. very interesting, cool ideas. They are very contingent and highly situational. In the course of our 4 sessions, I think they came up very few times, if at all, in play. And I think that's a challenging thing because there's so much to kind of keep a hold of. As a player, it's easy to forget that you have these expertise. And, I don't want the MC to have to remember that you have these expertise and put situations there. So that was another just little thing. But again, this was a very light attempt to have an add-on for Haunted West to let you play a PBTA approach to it. All of that, again, being said, which is my default, yes, I sound like I'm being negative, but phrase, I would love to see some folks take this basic starting point PBTA and develop it further. I'd like to see some add-on materials. I think tweaking some of the basic moves and adding a few basic moves could work. Maybe clarifying or opening up some of the choices so that they're easy to work with would be great. I'd also like to see someone sit down and look at the GM material that's in the trad section of the book and come up with a set of GM moves and GM principles that are tweaked to the genre that would help the GM find the places to come up with the flavor of that. I think that would be great. And maybe somebody will do that down the road. I really hope so. By its nature, this is going to be an incomplete game. I get that. And I would like to see more. I think that's a net positive then. Thoughts, questions, humongous book?
Yeah, I find with a lot of attempts at converting something between the trad sphere into PBTA or vice versa, it's very hard to do because the systems have very different intentions. Because from a basic standpoint, the trad system is meant to be a simulation, whereas PBTA is meant to be an emulation of the genre rather than a simulation of the world. And I think you would have to start from the ground to just have it even in the same setting. To try to derive the rules from one another it's a humongous task, really.
Yeah, I think you're right. It does require a real going back and thinking, what is the emulation that we can draw from this? What is the genre? What is the focus here? I had adapted Changing the Lost, and I had to throw away about 50-60% of the sort of core materials to even kind of get to a PBTA adaptation of that.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
It still has a bazillion moves, just to keep some of the flavor. They're all choice moves for a given thing, but that's a good point.
Mm-hmm.
It's such a big difference of what they're trying to do. Just like in PBA, trying to go, this playbook is always better at doing a thing, which you can do easily in a trad game. But in PBTA, it's so much harder because the dice are, big. It's a group of outcomes, right?
Mm-hmm.
So.
And I'm just as a side note about the expertise, I'm wondering if just placing that somewhere else on a character keeper could help matters. Again, I'm going to reference the Between. It has dawn questions which are highly specific, in which you're but you can pretty much almost always hit them during any session. Just I'm wondering if just placement wise, that could help.
That's a really good point.
Hi listeners, I wanted to let you know that new issues of Codex are now available in the Gauntlet Patreon feed. Codex is the Gauntlet's bi-monthly role-playing game magazine. Each issue is organized around a theme and stuffed with brand new material for your table, including original games and supplemental material for games like Trophy and Brindlewood Bay. Check out Codex by going to patreon.com/gauntlet. Your pledge not only gets you Codex and other Gauntlet publications, but it also supports all the important work we do in the Gauntlet, including this very podcast. If you'd like to try before you buy, there's always a free issue of Codex available on our website, gauntlet-rpg.com. And if you're looking for back issues, you can find them on DriveThruRPG, including in reduced price bundles. Thanks.
So listeners, for our second segment, our guest Steph is going to talk about a topic of their choice. What did you want to talk about today?
I want to talk about identity and erasure of identity within games, specifically within playing the games.
Okay.
For listeners, I am a trans non-binary person. My pronouns are he, they, and a lot of times I notice queerness in games tends to get, pushed down quite a bit. For example, in Bluebeard's Bride, there's a lot of gender exploration, but, people, and when I say, oh yeah, this is very important to me as a queer person about this, people get a little bit a question mark over the heads of why, wait, what? I thought this game was about feminism and horror and just being a woman, not queerness. And when I say Alice is Missing is a queer game, people are like, what are you talking about? And I'm it's specifically about a girl who gets kidnapped and she has a secret girlfriend. And for an assumption about the game, it's assumed that she's not out yet. So, how is that not queer? And it gets even more persuasive even when, the games themselves say, hey, they are queer and outright. A lot of things get diminished, such as, aging queer teens to adults because it's ooh, that's too inappropriate. Or asking, for example, Brindlewood Bay. It's not inherently a queer game, but I've noticed a lot of people are how can we remove the Maven's sexuality out of this game? How can we remove the romance? How can we make the Mavens into not women? Just, people are so uncomfortable with the idea of trying to be someone they aren't in real life. It's just why is that? I can understand that, hey, a trans man wants to play, a trans person in game and they're uncomfortable with being a woman because, it's misgendering and that sort of thing. I can understand that, but, I'm seeing this from very cis and heterosexual places where it's just, it just makes me a little upset. And it gets to the point where it's just, at certain tables, I'm uncomfortable to play at because, even though I'm playing a queer character, it's presumed that the character is straight, cis. My characters often are the only characters that get misgendered at the table. There could be another guy at the table playing a woman, and that character won't get misgendered at all. But the moment I start playing a non-binary character, I get misgendered. And it's not even with my own pronouns. It's just ridiculous. And the final little tangent I'm going to go on is actually very much about queer games that tell queer stories. And okay. I'm going to use a comparison of Thirsty Sword Lesbians and Dungeon Bitches. Very two different extremes of the queer storyline. Thirsty Sword Lesbians, I love, and it's near and dear to my heart. But one of the reasons why it's so successful is because the material it's based upon was made for a straight audience. It's based upon cartoons such as She-Ra, Steven Universe, that sort of thing, where the creators of those genres had to fight tooth and nail to have any queerness at all. And it's very much meant for children. And as an adult, I struggle with this because I want to be a queer adult. I want to be treated as this. I want to play games in which I get to experience things that I didn't experience, like being like a teen, going to prom, that sort of thing. But, those stories get denied time and time again. And then you've got games like Dungeon Bitches, which is, the total extreme, and it's just so hard to bring to the table because they're oh, that's too sexual, that's too traumatic, and people don't want to touch it. And the people that do want to touch it, I know their personal experiences, and I know how much they would struggle with the game.
Can you unpack Dungeon Bitches for us for a minute? Because I don't know if the audience is going to be as familiar with that. Thirsty Sword Lesbians, as you said, has gotten a lot of attention. Dungeon Bitches less so.
Yeah. This is a game in where disaster lesbians get fucked up in dungeons. Here's the pitch. It's a faux, medieval, gritty fantasy setting with all your standard crap, hetero-patriarchal assumptions, political marriages, dowries, etc., etc. Not the best society to be a queer girl in. Luckily, if the thought of getting married off and having to pretend like you're happy with that is too much for you, there are two options. You can run away and join a nunnery. This is the slightly more socially acceptable and much less likely to get you killed, but is also the result of in living a life defined by limitations and restrictions. The other option, you can run away, join a band of similarly heavily armed bitches, and make a living as mercenaries, tomb robbers, and adventurers. This is far less socially acceptable and far more dangerous. But you might be rich, fall in love, and be able to wreak terrible vengeance upon the society around you.
Mm-hmm.
This is assumed about the PCs. You are queer, you're a woman, and you have no place in polite society.
So, are there other games that you can think of that maybe are supporting queer identity in play? I mean, and I say this as a cis white male by asking this question. I want to be absolutely clear about that. Certainly, for many people, Monster Hearts was the first game to kind of open that space up. Do you want to talk about that?
I have actually not played Monster Hearts. It's probably somewhere in my library, but I've seen like a few different people play it, and they were like, "Oh yeah, we took Monster Hearts, game about playing teens in high school, to playing college age students," and I'm like, why? Like, you don't have to include sex in the game while talking about sexuality. I think that is a very distinct perspective, because from the moment we are born, you are always talking about sexuality. Like, we put infants in shirts called, like, chick magnets. Like, you can engage in sexuality for an appropriate level for teens. Like, and people just keep on just getting like, oh, this is just too uncomfortable. And I'm just like, but you watch stuff like Twilight and Teen Wolf and like that sort of thing, and it just drives me crazy. A game that I do think is so specific that I don't think really you can't change whatsoever. You cannot erase the queerness, because like it's inherently within all of the mechanics, within all of the playbooks and whatnot. And I think The Girlfriend of My Girlfriend Is My Friend is a very good game, because like it's all of the playbooks are different ways to engage with being trans. And it's told in the way where it doesn't specify whether it's about teens or adults. It's just like, in this moment, you are experiencing these things. Take that as what you will. It's very refreshing, because it's not at either extreme where it's, oh, very sexual and just like isolates people, or it's very tame and a little bit doesn't really apply to me. It's not the type of thing I want to engage with. It's not complicated. The game is complicated, but in a way that celebrates the complication.
Do you think that is there a parallel between this kind of reaction to gender identity and sexual identity and conflating that with sex and this current atmosphere of attacks on LGBTQA persons? Like we're certainly seeing that going on, where they are conflating those as a means of attack.
I would think so. I think just even in supportive tables, like they're like, yes, trans women are women. It's such ingrained in our society to not explore these things. It's just, you don't want to touch it lest you mess it up, because it's considered like, ooh, sacred or something. I can't remember who said this, but I heard the saying of, like, it's much easier to be violent in a game than to be vulnerable in a game, because exploring gender and exploring identity requires a lot of vulnerability.
Sherri?
I find one of the things that's real interesting is, like, you mentioned Monster Hearts and people aging it up. And I have seen that a few times, but I've seen lots of where they're playing it with high school. But one of the things that struck me is that they really lead into the monster tropes are like the things that free them up to play out the sort of wrestling with the queer identity. And it's interesting to me because I know that Ray Nanjiani considers Apocalypse Keys to be an incredibly queer game. But I wonder if it is because of that sort of inherent, like, the idea of monster is like why people, I don't know, why, it's that I understand it as the struggle, right? but if there's, there's a whole thing of that there's something bad.
I could go on and, like, cite, like, specific, like, for example, you've got vampires. The original vampire story was about a lesbian, like, and you've got Frankenstein, and the sort of, like, it gives a lot of symbolism between, like, father and son sort of imagery, but it also, like, there is a side story where Mr. Frankenstein, like, he's struggling relating to other men, and, like, he's building this man as the ideal version of it secretly, and, like, he desires it in a sort of a way. So, like, queerness in monsters go hand in hand. I would say that the idea of monsters is stuff that we personally struggle with. Any ideas such as we struggle with death, we struggle with identity, we struggle with society. It's all related.
We struggle with uncertainty. I know for me, and I think of myself as my teenage years, that was the most confused time. And when I look back, I say I was a monster, right? because I had no idea what I was doing. I was flailing around, You destroyed things because you were trying to figure out who you were. So to me, it seems like Monster Heart is absolutely the right age. High school is absolutely the right age for all that, because you're just coming out of the middle school years. You're a monster. You're your most monstrous self. It gets better, right?
So, Steph, are there any things that you would like to suggest to GMs who want to be more open or accepting of this? I know in the Gauntlet we've tried to make a strong case, a strong push that you always need to identify pronouns for your character and for yourself, and that players and GMs need to make sure that you're respecting those pronouns for both while we're playing. But is there anything else you'd want to point to, suggest for people?
I would suggest to consider reading more, like, books, reading into sort of metaphors, because a lot can go into a game by considering, well, not just the surface level, but engaging with the material on a deeper level of, like, who made the game? What is the purpose of this game getting made? For gendering people correctly at the table, if you have 2 screen monitors, that's easy because, like, you can just have people change their screen names to include their pronouns. You could also put on sticky notes just saying, this is this pronoun, and this is who is tied to, and stuff. And just question about, why does every NPC need to be either he or she? There's lots of pronouns out there. There's neo-pronouns, and I'm not sure if it's in the base game or in the additional materials, but Thirsty Sword Lesbian has, like, a huge table of pronouns to use, and, like, it's weird. It's a little bit on the sillier side, but it's important, because people are a spectrum of all sorts of experiences, And definitely, if you can, just ask questions. Be willing to be wrong about things. Like, you don't have to be mean about it, but, like, if you're saying, like, hey, I want to do this sort of character, but I don't want to, like, fall into any stereotypes. Is there anything major I should avoid? Or, hey, is there a book I can read? Or something about that.
Anything else you want to say on the topic? I'm really glad you brought this up.
Not that I can think of.
Okay. I hope that this is useful for people. Listeners, in our third segment, each of us is going to briefly discuss something that is lately inspiring us or giving us joy. Sherri, what is giving you life?
Oh, man. As I have mentioned, I'm in the middle of a huge project. Done before this month is out. It better be, dang it. But I have been so exhausted and so wiped out from it that the thing that has been giving me life is that for a precious hour or two each day, not every day, just some days, I can play Cozy Grove. And it's this video game. It's the simplest little, like, oh, no big deal. There's some things that these little NPC characters would like you to do, and it is literally a video game about coloring in the world with light, helping these bear ghosts to turn into, like, to ascend and get past their problems that they had in life just by going and getting them things and helping them work through their memories. It's about planning lots of things and feeding lots of animals. It is like there's nothing to it but a little task list, some cute dialogue, and pretty colors. And it is like, and it never shames me for not doing something or not finishing something or not being there every day. It's just, hey, you're here. Here's things that we would like you to do. And it's always charming, and it's about exactly the energy level that I can handle when I'm truly exhausted. Just lovely. So, if you just need a game that you can chill to.
And that's on the Switch, right?
It's on the Switch, but I think it's on other systems as well.
Steph, what is giving you life?
This is going to be a very odd one for me because, like, I like to play a lot of rules light tabletop games, but I've been really enjoying the Earthdawn Survival Guide podcast. For all you who don't know what Earthdawn is, it's an alternative to D&D. It's like Fallout meets medieval fantasy, and it's crunchy to all get out. It has terrible character sheets. I don't like them. But boy, my friend Josh makes a podcast, and I just love listening to him just talk about, like, the game and how it interacts. In one of the more recent episodes, he got on a guest from the Crit Show to talk about safety tools, which is something you really don't see in the trad sphere, and, like, it's a very good thing to listen to because it's just, like, I'm just charmed by, like, how magical the world feels because, like, I don't really get that from D&D or listening to D&D podcasts, but listening to this one, you do get the sense of the magic.
Yeah, there's a lot of cool... Earthdawn looks cool. It's another one of those games that I've looked at, I'm like, oh, maybe, but then I look at the rules, and I'm like, oh.
I think there's a dice bot that fixes, like, a lot of the weird dice mechanics because, like, it's... You don't use the same dice for rolling actions, and because of that, the higher skilled you are in a thing, the more dice you roll. And it's just like, you go from, like, a 2d6 to a d12, and silly stuff like that.
So, finally, what's giving me life is, after having watched a bunch of Kate Bush music videos on YouTube, I had some recommendations popped up, and I found a new artist, a young woman named Sarah Barrios, who I love. Added to my thing, really cool songs. Two songs of hers that I really love. Thank God You Introduced Me to Your Sister, which the music video is great for. And also Make Me a Villain. Both great. Like, they're great songs. And the rest of her EPs are solid, listenable. I really dig her. Good pop songs, but a little bit like Olivia Rodrigo, what a big range. like of different styles and so on. So really good, really enjoying that. That's our show. Thank you so much for playing with us. You can check out the show notes for links about the games that we've discussed, and you can find out more about the Gauntlet at www.gauntlet-rpg.com, where you can find articles, podcast info, our blog, links to our forums, information on how to play with us. You can also follow us on Twitter at Gauntlet RPG. If you're interested in playing with the Gauntlet, do check out our forums or check out our Patreon at patreon.com/Gauntlet. We have a program for marginalized gamers or those suffering from financial hardship to get you in. So I'd like to encourage you to do that. And remember, the hard part is spelling Gauntlet right, which I always make a mistake with. Sherri, thank you so much for co-hosting again.
It was a joy and a pleasure.
And Steph, thank you so much for coming on the program. And on short notice and a quick turnaround, I really appreciate that.
Yeah, I don't have too much doing right now, so.
Yes. And listeners, that is our show.